Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. I hereby call the meeting to order. This is an open meeting of the Broadcast Board of Governors being held in compliance with the government in the Sunshine Act. A digital recording of this meeting will be available for on-demand viewing on the BBG website, bbg.gov. Chairman Jeff Shell cannot be here today in person, but is joining us via video conference. As such, he has asked me to serve as the presiding governor to conduct today's meeting, which I'm happy to do. Also joining us by telephone is Governor Leon Aaron.
Yes.
I am joined here in D.C. by Governors Matt Armstrong, Ryan Crocker, Karen Kornbluth, Ken Weinstein, and Undersecretary Richard Stengel. Around the world, our journalists continue to risk their lives to report the news, and I'm sorry to say that one young man paid the ultimate price. On January 17th, freelance journalist Amigdad Mojali, who was on assignment for the Voice of America, was killed in an air raid in Yemen. Amigdad was reporting on the human economic impact of the Yemeni conflict when he was killed in a Saudi-led military coalition airstrike. Amigdad was a special talent. Each day he focused his talent on shedding light on the horrors of war from the point of view of those living it. To do so, he put himself in harm's way alongside those who were most vulnerable, interviewing Black Yemenis suffering from crushing poverty, or a blind child whose school had been bombed, and others. He was courageous and committed to telling the stories of those impacted by war, and in doing so, helping us understand the truth of what is happening in Yemen. Yesterday, in a very solemn ceremony, we remembered Amigdad and his photograph to the Fallen Journalist Memorial, and we added his photograph to the Fallen Journalist Memorial here in the Cone Building. We will not soon forget him. I would like to ask that we observe a moment of silence for Mr. Mujali. The board will honor Mr. Mujali in a resolution later on in our meeting. In Azerbaijan, RFE-RL contributor Hadisha Mislova marked 15 months behind bars despite widespread condemnation of her case and high-profile demands for her release. We join members of Congress, especially House Foreign Affairs Chairman Ed Royce and Representative Chris Smith, in calling for her immediate release. We also call for the release of RFE-RL Turkmen service contributor, and again, I apologize in advance if I don't get the next few names exactly right, but I'll do my best. Saparmed Neparkulev, who continues to be held incommunicado by Turkmen authorities since July 2015. In Afghanistan, the Taliban has denounced VOA's Dewa service, and someone has sent death threats to a VOA stringer, all in response to the reporting on the assassination of a Taliban commander. A VOA Russian service reporter has received threats on her personal Facebook account. In Iraq, Al-Hurra Iraq journalist Hadid Baghi received a death threat after reporting on a $4 million embezzlement and fraud scheme. In China, the harassment of journalists' families continues. We have received news from RFA that Uyghur service reporter Zhali Koshgare has had family members in far western China questioned and harassed by Chinese police last year. Her mother's home was searched, and she was interrogated about her son working for RFA. The family of RFA Tibetan service stringer Stopa Gyatso continues to be harassed by Chinese authorities who have detained his 70-year-old father who lives in China's Tibetan area. But there is also some good news to report. In late December, two jailed brothers of RFA Uyghur Service reporter Shoret Hashor were released and reunited with their families. One brother of Shoret Hashor still remains jailed. However, we call on Chinese authorities to release him immediately. Now let's turn to the business before today. The presence of 5 or more governors satisfies the board's quorum requirement, and a quorum being present, the board may conduct business based on majority vote. On February 12th, the board received email materials for the consent agenda, which allowed sufficient time for all governors to review the agenda prior to this meeting. We did not receive comments from any governor. This month's consent agenda includes the minutes of the December 16 meeting, a resolution honoring Mr. Amigdala Majula, and the many decades of service of VOA's Creole service. At this time, I would like to ask if any governors have comments on the consent agenda. Do you want to read these resolutions? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read a few resolutions that are part of the consent agenda. Resolution honoring Amigdala Majula. Whereas Amigdala Majula served as a freelance reporter in Yemen for the Voice of America from October 2015 through January 2016. Whereas Mr. Majoli specialized in reporting on humanitarian war and conflict issues and contributed to the Integrated Regional Information Networks and the Telegraph. Whereas Mr. Majali was a talented and committed journalist who risked his life during armed conflicts to cover humanitarian crises, expose human rights abuses, and provide unbiased reporting. Whereas Mr. Majali was committed to nonviolent solutions in providing a voice for the most vulnerable members of society. Whereas Mr. Majali was a loving father and a man with 7 dependents, including a small son. And whereas Mr. Majali gave his life so that others would have access to uncensored information. Now therefore be it resolved that the Broadcasting Board of Governors hereby expresses its appreciation for Mr. Majali's courage and invaluable contributions in furthering the mission of the Voice of America. Be it further resolved that an appropriate copy of this resolution be forwarded to the family of Mr. Majali. And one more resolution. Resolution honoring the 30th anniversary of the Voice of America's Creole service. Whereas the Voice of America Creole service started as a 5-minute news feed in the early 1980s with one broadcaster, and it became a regularly scheduled broadcast on February 7th, 1986, when a popular uprising forced Haitian dictator Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier into exile. Whereas VOA Creole remains one of the most reliable and trustworthy sources of news and information for Creole speakers in Haiti, with research indicating 81.6% of weekly listeners trust the news and information they receive from the Creole service. Whereas in the past 30 years, the Creole service has covered many stories of significance to Haitian audiences, including the rise and fall of the first democratically elected president in Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the January 20th earthquake that killed hundreds of thousands and left more than 1 million homeless in Haiti, the inauguration of Barack Obama as the first African-American president of the United States, and whereas in cooperation with other U.S. government agencies, such as the U.S. Department of State, VOA Creole Service provides training for Haitian journalists, with more than 100 journalists being trained in sessions in Washington and Haitian cities since 2008. Now therefore be it resolved by the Broadcasting Board of Governors that we celebrate and commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Voice of America's Creole service. Be it further resolved that the Broadcasting Board of Governors commends and congratulates both the current and former members of the Voice of America's Creole service for their dedication in serving the Haitian community and implementing U.S. foreign policy goals through open communication of information and ideas in the Creole language. Do any governors wish to move for adoption of the consent agenda by the board? Ken Weinstein?
Second.
Second. Matt Armstrong? All in favor, please say aye. Please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any objections? Hearing none. So this brings us to our public comment portion of our meeting. The board permits members of the public who register to attend our open meetings the opportunity to speak for up to 3 minutes. I understand we have 3 members of the public here today who would like to make remarks. Please come up to the table and introduce yourself before you speak. Can we start with Ann Noonan?
Thank you. My name's Ann Noonan. I'm the Executive Director for the Committee for U.S. International Broadcasting. For the record, this week marks my 5th year working on these issues. Before that time, while I knew what Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and Radio Marti were, I had no idea what the BBG was. Now I do. Since Ted Lippian and I co-founded CUSIB, which for those who may not know is a bipartisan volunteer NGO that supports journalism for media freedom and human rights, we have been able to provide assistance to journalists and people here at the BBG. CUSIB hopes that new, highly qualified outside candidates will be selected as soon as possible to lead VOA and RFERL. When the United Nations recognized World Radio Day last week, I saw a message asking, why is radio so important? Their answer was because 95% of the world have access to it, far more than internet or TV. While CUSIB is relieved to see no cuts nor reductions in Cantonese, Mandarin, nor Tibetan services in the BBG's 2017 budget, I know that there is still strong opposition to Voice of America shortwave and medium wave radio services, and some of those opponents are right here in this room. Can any governor here at this table assure CUSIB that radio broadcasts on China will be protected, especially since we all know that the crackdown on internet users in China is causing the arrest and imprisonment of Chinese freedom fighters, Roman Catholics and people of other faiths, democracy seekers, and women who don't want to be forcibly aborted? CUSIB remains concerned about poor people in China and Tibet who do not have access to cell phones or internet and who are desperate for uncensored news and human rights. With a quick look at BBG's 2017 proposed budget, I have to ask how the BBG proposes to give hope to millions while proposing cuts to RFA, expecting them to operate at 2012 levels. And yes, at the same time, there are proposed increases for the already bloated International Broadcasting Bureau. Can any governor here at this table explain to CUSIB why the budget cuts for other entities have been increased, but RFA's budget has been reduced? Is RFA's work not valued? CUSIB values the services and the soft diplomacy that RFA provides. With China flexing its muscles all over the world, censoring the internet, putting military assets in the South China Sea, cracking down domestically on every human right, especially religious freedom. It defies understanding that RFA is doing more and more every year with less and less money. CUSIB supports RFE's expansion into television, but again, why are they doing this with zero increase? CUSIB would like to request for the public to have access to the ICC meeting minutes and for these minutes to be open to the public. In the spirit of transparency in government, we would like to know what transpires at these meetings, and we would like for these meetings to be live streamed and accessible to the general public. Finally, we are requesting for speaking time to the public to be extended from 3 minutes to 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Joseph Noonan?
My name is Joseph Noonan. I will be delivering a statement on behalf of CUSIB's co-director, Ted Lippian, who is unable to travel to Washington for this meeting. A problem waiting nearly 2 decades for a solution can have an optimal one, a marginal one. A problem, nearly 2 decades for a solution can have an optimal one, a marginal one, but also one that could make the problem far worse than it is now. Unfortunately, the latter is what the Broadcasting Board of Governors is doing in resisting reforms in the bipartisan bill H.R. 2323 and lobbying against it. I have great respect for Chairman Schell and Mr. Lansing, and I appreciate some positive changes they have made. But the so-called consolidation and centralization under one empowered CEO as a solution to the BBG being broken is the wrong approach. It lacks a strategic vision for both U.S. public diplomacy and media outreach. I would ask you to consider for a moment what the consolidation of the United States Information Agency into the State Department has brought. The Iranian opposition is convinced that we have abandoned them. President Obama announced a major move of his reset with Russia on the anniversary of the Soviet invasion of a neighboring country. The reset policy itself was a fiasco. The State Department's public diplomacy couldn't even get the spelling of reset right in Russian for Secretary Clinton. The Cuba opposition thinks that we have betrayed them. That's not how public diplomacy should perform for America. The BBG now wants to compound the failure of its bureaucracy by consolidating it with and giving it control over the surrogate broadcasters. If we want to counter ISIS and Putin's propaganda, it's a kiss of death in the digital age, even worse than consolidating USIA within the State Department. As to the one empowered CEO concept, that's not how government works. Under USIA, we had graduates at the top of U.S. universities taking foreign service exam, speaking multiple languages. VOA was able to attract similar talent, hundreds of such internationally minded and creative leaders. Under BBG, we have seen former associates of former BBG members being hired after they were laid off from the private sector. BBG managers did not think for a moment it was a bad idea for U.S. government to do a poll in an illegally annexed territory like Crimea and report with pride that nearly everybody loves Putin. They somehow overlooked the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian refugees. Public diplomacy at state said nothing. One empowered CEO cannot compensate for such a lack of knowledge and a lack of institutional structure. Public diplomacy, media outreach, and counter-violent extremism are distinct areas which cannot and should not be consolidated under accidental bureaucrats. Bureaucratic centralization is not the answer for a creative intellectual effort within the government. These different activities need separate management under structures and separate oversight. I would therefore urge you to go for an optimal solution to the BBG problem. Instead of resisting H.R. 2323, work with Congress to make it even better by strengthening public diplomacy, putting it in separate agencies together with VOA and its charters, while keeping surrogate media vigorous, separate, and independent. It has worked before, it can work now. What will not work is keeping the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Adam Powell?
Thank you and good morning. My name is Adam Powell. I am the president of the Public Diplomacy Council, and I'm also a senior fellow at the University of Southern California. What I'm about to say are my personal views and do not reflect the views of those organizations. First, to begin with a couple of sentences, words that are not my own. Stonewall Jackson, who knew something about the use of weapons, is reported to have said, "When war comes, you must draw the sword and throw away the scabbard." The trouble with broadcasting is that it is rusting in the scabbard during a battle for survival. Those aren't my words, those are the words of Edward R. Murrow, someone who used to work in this building. He spoke them years before he came here while he was still at CBS. His words are instructive for us living in another age, but why was Murrow so revered? A personal anecdote, if I may. A few years ago in Los Angeles, I ran into James Brooks, the creator of TV series including Taxi, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and Lou Grant, movies, broadcast news, Terms of Endearment, and for more than 20 years, The Simpsons. Chairman Schell, you probably know him. Brooks reminded me that he and I had been desk assistants at CBS News in the early 1960s, and he asked me what I did then. I said I ran copy for the new guy, Mike Wallace. He looked at me and said in approximately this cadence, "I once made coffee for Edward R. Murrow." I folded. Nancy Cartwright, an actress who does some of the voices on The Simpsons, overheard us and said, "You guys are crazy." Brooks turned to her and said, "It was the best time of my life." Why does someone who has made more money than most can imagine remember a lowly job where, if memory serves, we were paid $16 a week gross? The answer, I think, is in experience. Murrow's skills of communication, words, and leadership were legend and well-earned. Here's more from Murrow. Mature Americans can engage in conversation and controversy, the clash of ideas, with communists anywhere in the world without being contaminated or converted. I believe that our faith, our determination, our conviction are stronger than theirs, and that we can compete successfully, not only in the arena of bombs, but in the arena of ideas. The challenge today for those of you in this building and beyond, how best to draw the sword. One answer may be Director Lansing's proposal for more acquisitions. You can make this a center of excellence, attracting the work of the best reporters and producers from around the country and indeed from around the world. What is the best documentary about freedom, about democracy? When I ran NPR News, we started just such a fund with little money, low six figures, and won every award in radio. In addition to worthy internal awards, BBG could and should have entries, winning entries, in the Peabodys, the Ohio State, the George Polk Awards, Columbia DuPont, and yes, the Academy Awards. Okay, not in time for Sunday night, but maybe next year and year after that. Take Stonewall Jackson's advice: draw the sword, throw away the scabbard. If you find that excellence in that voice, a generation from now, a multimillionaire might look back on his youth and say, "I once made coffee in the Cohen building." Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like CEO and Director John Lansing to give a brief report on his efforts since the last board meeting.
Thank you, Governor Kempner. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start off this morning by introducing our new Chief Financial Officer, Grant Turner. Grant comes to us from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and he's highly recommended by the Office of Management and Budget. He just began this week on Monday, and we welcome Grant to the executive team.
Thanks, Sean. It's good to be here. I'll just say that I appreciate the warm welcome that I've gotten throughout the building, and for those who've come from outside the building as well. I'm so impressed by the passion, dedication, and deep expertise of the BBG staff, and I look forward to working really cooperatively with everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Grant. I also want to note that Connie Stevens, who was our acting CFO since the entire time I've been here, she's not here today, but she did a fantastic job, and I'd like to publicly acknowledge the great work she did, particularly on the FY17 budget and the FY16 programming plan. So could I ask for a round of applause for Connie, please? Thank you. Somewhere Connie is smiling, I'm sure. Speaking of the FY17 budget request, I'm really pleased that the President's budget is investing in the BBG with an additional 3.7% or $28.2 million over the approved 2016 plan. I believe the result is that good because of the work of the ICC, the 5 entity heads working together under one CEO, as a matter of fact, put together a fantastic strategy and budget narrative that led to this really great investment. Now, to detail the investments, I'm going to ask some of my colleagues to weigh in. The largest single investment for the FY17 plan is $15 million for expanding digital, mobile, and social content, particularly in the Russian periphery. So I'll start with Noonan to talk about their portion of that $15 million, which is $10 million for RFE and RL. Noonan.
Thank you. First of all, we want to increase our satellite stream to Russia periphery and Russia itself through digital operation, and this is the #1 priority in partnership with our affiliates. And the plan is to increase authorized stream content from 6 to 8 hours in fiscal 17. Number two, I'm going to say a sentence about U.S. elections that at first kind of
Hey, we can't hear on the phone. I don't know if Ninad has his microphone.
Your mic
or not.
on? Ninad?
here
Yeah,
these days when I spend my free time watching TV and I see election campaign and I see many experts, journalists are talking about how voters here in the States express their anger, and this is why some of the presidential candidates managed to get them and to vote for them. I want to say that I do recognize the same anger in our broadcast area. And of course, anger has completely different content. But whatever you touch in the world, you see that anger. Just in terms of the numbers, for instance, so-called engaged users on the Facebook at RFRL, we had 2014, we had 60 million. In 2015, we have 115 million engaged users. We want to catch this energy because you see the way they comment on the sites, the way how they communicate on the sites, you see they want to express themselves and to do something. This is why we want to catch this energy mostly through digital media. This is why we want to increase digital media operation in Central Asia. Launch content related to violent extremism, and of course, in addition to that, in addition to Russia, increase it to FARDA.
Thank you, Nenad. And then, as part of the $15 million investment, VOA received $3.5 million. And Keilu, would you please comment on that?
Okay, sure. Of course, we will increase VOA's presence on the current time content stream. We will expand our existing business programming, and because business is where that really kills the economies and so forth inside of Russia. We also want to expand VOA's digital team. We want to expand our Russian-focused content from virtual bureaus such as several major U.S. cities. We want to also commission weekly documentary series, Russian in America. We want to demonstrate the appeal of free market capitalism and the role of citizens in a democracy. Lastly, we're not just confined Russian in the Russians. We're moving this also to our Ukrainian service. We will extend our 30 minutes of very popular Miroslava Gongadze's prime time this year. We also will customize our English teaching program to Ukraine and to Russia. And with other money, including in this $3.5 million, we want to expand our next generation influencers in some of the territories that negatively impacted by ISIL or a terrorist. So that's.
Thank you, Keilu. And filling out the $15 million is $1.5 million for TSI to facilitate some of this programming. Andre, our Chief Technology Officer, Andre Mendez.
Thank you, John. This is a direly needed investment. The majority of it is going to be used to finance an expansion of our digital storage environment, which by the time this investment comes about will be about 7 years old, something that would be unthinkable in the private sector. In the last 5 years or so, our needs for digital storage have grown 20-fold. And we are operating with the same piece of equipment that we bought 5 years ago. So hopefully this will be a tremendous boost to our storage capability.
Great, thank you, Andre. The next significant investment is $2.5 million to raise the highly successful, the highly successful Raise Your Voice campaign that was developed through MBN under Brian Conniff. And so, Brian, talk about how that expansion will take place.
Thank you, John. The portion of this investment will allow MBN to establish a new digital platform designed to engage with the people of Egypt. As you mentioned, it's based on our experience with the Raise Your Voice digital platform in Iraq, and is consistent with the audience's preference for local media outlets. And as suggested by this request, we believe it's a format for the future.
So one of the most successful examples of cooperation between the entities is Raise Your Voice, and as part of this investment, the Raise Your Voice franchise now moves to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Nenad?
Thank you, John, and thank Brian for this great initiative. We are going to increase it and use this model to go to Central Asia and the Balkans. I'll give you just one example. Recently, we had a case in Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, that the lady who was dressed in Western way was beaten up. We want to use this kind of example from life, report about it, and then increase and force or provoke, whatever you want to say, people to raise their voice against this kind of behavior.
That's fantastic. And I know Kay-Lou, this isn't part of FY17, but part of existing funds that we can shift around. Kay-Lou, seeing the success of Raise Your Voice on NBN and the idea for RFE, had this idea for VOA.
Yes, we will expand this Raise Your Voice campaign to very important service, a Hausa service, which is broadcasting to North Nigeria and facing Boko Haram's challenge. And so we will work with the radio and channel TV as our new affiliates, and also with digital team to initiate more town hall discussions and all media, more platforms discussions, engaging them.
Thank you, Kay-Lou. And then the next investment is $2 million to expand our research capacity. As you've heard me speak, and it's one of our 5 pillars, we're going to hold ourselves accountable not just to audience reach around the globe, but to the impact we can have after we reach an audience. So this $2 million will be directly related to investing in more qualitative research so we can measure the impact we're having around the world. An additional $2 million of investment in this budget is for our global distribution capacity, Andre, as well as the Kuwait transmitting station investment. Why don't you cover those two, please?
Absolutely. In terms of the expansion of global distribution, we are facing a situation where a lot of our target countries are making a migration to HD television, and so we need to ensure that we have enough space on the satellites that cover direct-to-home broadcasts so that we can run simultaneously HD TV and standard definition to accommodate as the population in the target countries transition. We're also making a substantial investment in terrestrial distribution via fiber optic because it's cheaper for distribution than satellite, and it will save the BBG substantial amount of money in outlying years. Now, regarding Kuwait, so this is a very interesting investment. We have recently installed over 20 FMs throughout the world. And we recognize that shortwave radio is still a very important medium in certain parts of the world. And we happen to have in Kuwait a station that has the lowest operating costs on the network. So by building shortwave capacity, even as we speak today in Kuwait, we're going to be able to migrate transmissions from other stations that operate at a much higher cost per hour, sometimes as much as 100-fold over Kuwait, so that we can continue to serve places like Tibet, like the Uyghur regions of China, places like Burma, places like North Korea, places like rural Afghanistan, where we expect this methodology to continue to be very viable in reaching some of the most underserved people in the world. So, we will build our capacity where it makes sense and save the overall agency a substantial amount of money in doing so.
Thank you, Andre. Governors, that's the complete investment story for the FY17. Before I move on in my report, are there any questions or comments?
I have a very quick question, Andre, and I don't know if you know the answer. Can one measure shortwave audience?
In a lot of our markets, measuring audiences is relatively difficult. For example, in North Korea, it's very difficult. So it has to rely mostly on anecdotes. In a country like China, for example, we have conducted extensive surveys. And they indicate that the usage is not what it used to be. Recently in Nigeria, we conducted an update of our in-country research regarding the methods by which they consumed our content. And we found that although in Nigeria shortwave is still a very viable methodology, it has nevertheless over the last 3 years experienced a decline of almost 50%. So yes, I think we can measure it. For example, in Cuba, although we did not measure it, there was recently a survey that was done by an independent organization that found that about 20% of the population reported hearing Radio Marti on a weekly basis. And so although we cannot ascertain whether they were listening on shortwave that we emanate out of Greenville, North Carolina, or medium wave that we emanate out of Marathon Island, it is nevertheless a clear indication that radio is a very viable methodology for reaching the population in Cuba that unfortunately is still operating under almost a complete blackout from a media standpoint. So, as we saw with Malula's presentation yesterday, radio is front and center in that particular market. So it is a tough proposition, Undersecretary, to measure it, but we do have some good data that shows trends over time.
Matt?
It's a good question. So was it 2 years ago now, we did this shortwave committee and to look at the viability of shortwave today, and what we did is not just look at the market, but look at our target audiences. Who are the demographics in those markets, and do they rely on shortwave? And so this helped narrow. It's not just can anybody in this area receive it, but the people that we intend to target, do they rely on shortwave, or can they and do they use alternative mediums? And it's really not can they, it's do they use alternative mediums? And what we found was that a number of audiences no longer rely on shortwave. In fact, they ran, and as Andre just mentioned, the fall off is precipitous. And they also don't go back to shortwave, despite the common narrative that in some sort of outage, man-made or not, they revert to shortwave. They don't. And so what we found, what we I suppose proved in this in-depth research that included a substantial State Department contribution from the field, and again, thank you, Dan Shrevny, for that assistance, was that for certain key markets or certain markets for this agency in support of our mission, there are audiences that continue to rely, audiences that we intend to reach that rely on shortwave. That's diminishing, but there are still folks out there. So that's part of the calculus, because as Andre said, and as you know, by definition, most of our audiences are hard to measure. It's hard to ask them, but that's the trend that we see.
All right. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about it. The Impact Summit that we had here, February 2nd and 3rd. Around the holiday season, management team was together. We were talking about our 5 strategic pillars, which I won't go over at this point, but the 5th and perhaps the most important is this notion of measuring impact. I mentioned the investment in research to do that. But to make sure we give life to that key strategic priority, we wanted to bring together all of our 5 entity heads, the ICC, the research directors, and the content managers, together for a 2-day summit meeting, the Impact Summit, to determine how it is we will consistently identify, measure, and hold ourselves accountable to impact, and what those specific impact measures might be, and when are those impact measures consistent across all 5 entities, and when are they unique to a particular entity. I want to ask Jeff Trimble to speak. He helped pull it together, did a fantastic job on the goals and the outcomes of the Impact Summit. Jeff?
Thank you very much. Well, during 2, I would call very rich days of very frank discussion, we did seek to develop consensus around an agreed definition of impact that would at the same time reflect an appropriate mix of quantitative and qualitative data and indicators. And we did this while working through how market differences necessitate nuanced impact measurement. We agreed on some general and specific parameters about impact. We agreed that the current mission statement defines in very broad terms what our impact should be. And that mission statement, again, is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. In terms of shaping an impact model, this translates into 3 pillars, if you will, of impact indicators: inform, engage, connect, and support freedom. There was consensus that indicators for measuring impact should be common where feasible, but that market specifics often will require market-specific indicators. So the very next day following the retreat, the research directors, who did a huge lift on getting this prepared and in working out details, so big thank you to them, met to begin to refine the summit discussions and outcomes. They are working to continuing to work to develop a draft model, and I should add that the impact model that we developed in 2015, which includes more than 30 impact indicators as variables, has been a good starting point for the new model. And we anticipate having a draft new impact model ready for further discussion by everybody in early March. And this should mean that the new model will be in place in plenty of time to inform the FY 2018 budget process.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. And we actually have a short video, I think it's a couple of minutes, that just gives you a sense of the summit and some of the outcomes that came along with it. Please roll that video. Yeah, I agree. It has about a 0.1 rating right now. So we will follow up with you on the at the next board meeting on the steps we'll take. But suffice it to say that the new measurement of progress and success of the BBG is impact. Now, last in my report is some really good news. Many of you know Mark Nathanson, who was a founding board member of the BBG. I had lunch with Mark here earlier this month, and he and his wife have decided to invest money in creating the new Nathanson Public Diplomacy Scholars Program at the BBG. And the idea that Mark and Jane have is to support mid-level management at the BBG to come out to the Aspen Institute for Management Training to give them the support for moving up the ranks for future leaders. So it's essentially a future leaders investment from the Nathansons and their foundation. And so Rob Fallon worked with the Aspen Institute on some of the details, and I'll get him off the hook a little bit and I'll let you start, but there's still a few details to be worked out, but it's going to happen, and we expect to announce the details within the next couple of weeks. But go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, CEO Lansing. And just to quickly go through this, as John mentioned, the Nathanson gift is essentially we expect it to go somewhere around 5 years, although that's obviously fluid. That would identify emerging leaders and middle management officials in areas related to public diplomacy and international media. So the first thing to know about this is that it's a broader effort that we would be playing into, but obviously there's a huge focus on what we do here, and this really gets to the heart of a big kind of focus for the CEO and I think the board, which is identifying the next generation of leaders and empowering them. So the goal is to provide those leadership opportunities and to fund the participation of identified candidates from the BBG component networks to participate in leadership training at the Aspen Institute. There's a couple different training tracks that this would be pursued along, and essentially executive training and leadership training there. So as John mentioned, there's work to be done on hammering out the what this looks like in practice. It's a new development, but it is something that we're really excited about, and I think certainly by the next board meeting, we hope to have for the board and for certainly interested members of the team what this will look like. So there's more to follow, and just stay tuned.
So, Mr. Chairman, I suggest a round of applause for Mark and Jane Nathanson. And that's my report. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I actually feel we owe you a round of applause. So Jeff, I hope you don't mind if I go off the script for a second, but I think I can speak on behalf of the entire board in thanking you for everything you have done since you've joined us and for, I mean, really an extraordinary pace of positive change. I haven't seen anything like it in my career. So, so thank you and your team and all of the agency heads for what has been just a whirlwind of positive activity since you joined.
Thank
So
you
thank
very
you
much.
so much.
Appreciate that.
Second that.
Any questions from the governors on anything we heard or anything else? No, so hearing none. So the board will now take a break and reconvene at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time to hear a conversation between CEO Lansing and the BBG networks regarding enhanced coordinating efforts. We will see you then. Thank you.
Okay. I have half an hour.